Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this curatorial roundtable of the exhibition Something New Must Turn Up, 6 Singaporean Artists After 1965. And this is actually a joint presentation of 6 solo artist exhibitions, Chng Seok Tin, Mohammad, Goh Beng Kwan, Eng Tow, Jaafar Latiff, as well as Lim Shujuan. So with me here today are my colleagues, and from my left, there's Cheng Jia Yun, who's also the curator of Chng Seok Tin, the exhibition Chng Seok Tin Drawn Through a Press, followed by, of course, Hui Min, who curated or co-curated the exhibition, right? Mohammad, the mistaken ancestor, together with Shabir Mustafa, who's unfortunately unable to join us today. And next, we have Joleen Loh, who's the curator of the exhibition Goh Beng Kwan, Nervous City, followed by Lim Shujuan, who's the curator of the exhibition Eng Tow, Sixth Sense, as well as followed by we have Goh Sze Ying, who's the curator of the exhibition, Jaafar Latiff in a Time of Textiles, and of course Adele Tan, who curated the exhibition Lim Shujuan at the Speed of Thought. So it is really wonderful that we are able to gather today physically. I think the curators have not gathered today ourselves since the exhibition opened. So it's really wonderful that we are able to gather here at the round table. And I'm sure it's also wonderful for many of you who are also, hopefully able to gather once the pandemic is over. And of course, due to the pandemic and safe distancing measures, we are now able to only meet mostly exclusively online. But at the National Gallery, Singapore is continuing to kind of launch and organize many of our programs online, such as this roundtable. So whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, please feel free to ask your questions, and you can type in your comments and at any point throughout this entire roundtable. And my colleagues, Lucas and Gillian, will be collating these questions, and they're working behind the scenes, and they will be sending these questions to us, and the curators will be addressing them later on. So allow me to start by briefly introducing the exhibition, Something New Must Turn Up, 6 Singaporean Artists After 1965. So before I start, I'd like to also kind of give a historical context to the exhibition, which also explains why we're locating it within a context of post-independence Singapore from 1965. So as we know, Singapore gained independence in 1965, and we were separated from Malaysia, which was an important moment, not just in terms of our own histories, but also in terms of generating cultural anxieties. Because prior to our separation from Malaysia, there was a process of Malayanization, whereby there was a desire to construct a kind of shared Malayan culture, which was really in a way in which Singapore could gain independence from the British. But with Singapore's separation in 1965, it generated cultural anxieties and raised the question of the role of artists and what they could do in shaping the cultural identities of Singapore now that we are newly independent. So this context of 1965 is important, but also extending into the decades of the 1970s and the 1980s, whereby there was this period or process of industrialization and urbanization that was happening in Singapore at a kind of a developmental state, was being created during these few decades. And of course, this had an impact on artists as well, as they engaged with kind of broader social, cultural, economic issues that mattered at that time. So coming back to the main exhibition title, which is Something New Must Turn Up, this was actually taken from Ho Ho Ying, who was also an artist, and at that time the president of the Modern Art Society, and it was really a clarion call for artists to create something new, something different, to be innovative and to experiment, and to push the boundaries of art making. And that was an important clarion call. I think that was, in a way, also taken up by many of all the 6 artists in this exhibition, which we will kind of discuss further. So now I will proceed to kind of give a brief introduction of each exhibition. So next slide, please. So first of all, it's the exhibition Chng Seok Tin, Drawn Through a Press. Yeah, and of course, Seok Tin was a very important printmaker, and she was also educated in Europe as well as in North America. And when she came back, She was one of the leading printmakers in Singapore, but unfortunately she lost most of her sight in 1988. And that was also, of course, it was a traumatic and of course a turning point of artistic practice, but she moved on and created and collaborated with artists and began to expand her artistic practice to include and started to make installations and sculptures that you will see in the exhibition. And she was also drawing from Chinese philosophies such as the I Ching, as well as drawing from other sources, including Hsin as well as San Mao. So next slide, and the next exhibition actually is Muhammad bin Muhammad's The Mistaken Ancestor. Yeah, and of course, Muhammad bin Muhammad was really a polymath. He wasn't just an artist; he was also a silat guru. He was a collector of Southeast Asian artifacts. He was an actor. He even composed music. But most important of all, he was a Sufi mystic. And that's really an important part of his practice, whereby he was kind of drawing from these different, cultural sources from the region and created these assemblages and paintings that you will see in the exhibition. Next slide is Goh Beng Kwan, Nervous City. And in this exhibition, you will see works by Goh Beng Kwan covering from when he was in Singapore and later on when he went to New York and he studied at the Art Students League and later at Provincetown where he studied under Leo Manso and he started to kind of create collages. And these collages are particularly important because he was kind of incorporating everyday materials into his collages as well as responding to the whole process of urbanization in Singapore when he returned in 1966. And this is very significant because he created a new series of what we call the Urban Renewal series, whereby he was responding to the rapid gentrification that was happening in Singapore due to urbanization back in the 60s and 70s. So the next slide and the next exhibition is Eng Tow's The Sixth Sense. And in this exhibition, you will see works by Eng Tow that covers, from her most recent works to the time when, of course, when she was also in London, in the UK, when she was pursuing her kind of studies in textiles, and she was exposed to the Bauhaus school and way of thinking that broke down the boundaries between, art, craft, as well as design. So here you will see the cloth works that she's most well known for, as well as her paper works that emerged from her residency or research in Japan, and whereby she was kind of interested in the medium of the material of paper, and also in ink painting as well. And next slide, and the next exhibition is Jaafar Latiff in the time of textile. And of course, Jaafar Latiff is a very important batik painter, and he shifted towards abstraction. And he was constantly innovating in the medium of batik painting. And he worked in series as well. So in this exhibition, you will see works whereby he was kind of working in these different series, including the Wandering series, the Batik series, and the Self-Portrait series as well. He was also an important teacher and educator. And he taught in various institutions, including Baharudin Vocational Institute, NIE, NAFA, LaSalle, SIA, and so on. He was also kind of innovative in his kind of experimentations in computer art, which leads us to the next exhibition, which is the next slide, Lim Shujuan Tin at Speed of Thought. And of course, Lim Shujuan Tin is another polymath, which is really a kind of similarity shared by many of the 6 artists in this exhibition. She was, a writer, a poet. She works, as an IT consultant as well as an inventor. She makes music compositions, and of course, most importantly, a painter as well as making digital art. So, of course, Lim Shujuan Tin was widely reported, to have established the first virtual art museum in 1994. And from then on, in fact, kind of abandoned the paintbrush for the PC mouse, right? And later on, abandoned the PC mouse to use her finger in order to make digital art. Right, so I think I've given an introduction to the exhibition, and now we will start to perhaps also to pose questions to the curators over here. And the first question that I'm going to ask is actually about the curatorial approach, right? And how we were kind of examining this exhibition comparatively, and we paired the artists, according to also, how they were had artistic practices that connected with each other, but perhaps also departed from each other. Perhaps, I would like to ask, maybe first of all, the first pairing, which is in the Singtel exhibition Gallery A, which is Jia Yun, as well as Hui Min, which is Chng Seok Tin, as well as Mohammad. So perhaps I can start with Jia Yun first to talk about some of the similarities and differences or departures, looking at the practices of these two artists.
Thanks, Eugene. I think for us, when we were discussing the links and the resonances between Chng Seok Tin and Mohammad, what we discovered was their very strong and deep interest and investment in non-Western paradigms of thinking. In the case of Seok Tin, this was very much manifested not only through her use and application of I Ching in making works like I Ching variation, but also in her pursuit of literary arts. And in her writing, because she was as much a writer as an artist, you very much see how she's able to incorporate references that are very much found in Chinese literature and Chinese thought. And yet, at the same time, these thoughts were very much being conveyed to the general reader, because these were published in newspapers such as Nanyang Xiangbao, among others. So I think, this thread of that interest and deep connection with these types of cultural movements that are not necessarily contemporary to their time, but in fact have very long traditions, is something that we found immediately kind of connecting these two artists.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as Jarin mentioned, for Chng Seok Tin, it was really that kind of recourse to very interesting Eastern and also Chinese philosophies. And for Mohammad, it was really his deep knowledge and interest in the Malay world. And again, very different kind of knowledge paradigm. He read very widely and deeply a lot of Sufi texts, anthropological ethnographies on the Malay world, and he also had a deep interest in artifacts from the Malay world. And I think for both the artists, what became really interesting was how these different accumulations of knowledge really came through in the artworks that they produced. And a lot of really interesting kind of congruences kind of emerged just as we were each planning our individual shows. I think not just in the tactility of a lot of the works, but I think interesting was also the kind of floor assemblages and installations, right, that really emerged.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the installations of both Mohammad and Chng Seok Tin really point to a sense of play and also experimentation. And at the same time, I think something that is worth acknowledging is the fact that, for an artist like Mohammad, he was also very aware of, museological structures, of how, ways of seeing, ways of knowing are characterized by those types of structures. And I think he then created those assemblages in response, I think, in a very self-reflexive response to some of those gestures and structures as well. And for Seok Tin, of course, she received such a broad education in printmaking from Europe through to North America, as Eugene mentioned. And she was also very aware of, this very research-based methodology that was emerging in the United Kingdom at the time, which is where she did her foundation studies and also her bachelor's and master's in fine arts. Yeah. So I think, looking at the two artists, they're in fact very kind of cosmopolitan figures, but we would really like to, see how their approaches can be seen in relation to one another, and yet also draw connections back to also the region and to Southeast Asia as well.
Yeah, I guess before we pass over to our colleagues, one kind of anecdote that I've heard from visitors and docents is that in that transition space between both our galleries, there's a moment of pause when they're wondering whether the I Ching variations is actually a work by Mohammad bin Mohammad and vice versa. So I think that's really interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah. And of course, both the artists also knew each other.
Yeah.
Mohammad bin Mohammad was very active in the Modern Art Society, and we have an incredible archival image of the both of them
Meeting.
And talking through one of Mohammad bin Mohammad's installative works.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. So perhaps we could also pass it on to Joleen as well as Shujuan.
Okay. I think the effects of seeing Goh Beng Kwan's works together with Eng Tow's was that you notice how much these two artists were deeply sensitive to their surroundings. So Eng Tow with the natural world and Goh Beng Kwan with his urban context, and how they both were very sensitive to, say, for instance, with Eng Tow, the changes in the natural world and the rhythms of it, and with Goh Beng Kwan, the sort of urban architectural fabric of the city. And additionally, also, both these artists were friends and shared a real friendship over decades, right? Their paths crisscrossed over a long time. In fact, both were part of the seminal artist run space, the Alpha Gallery, and were frequently together in several exhibitions. I guess also one other thing that Shujuan and I noticed while working on these exhibitions was how different the rhythms and textures of both these artists' works were, and we really tried to highlight that dynamism and not try and I guess find a balance between them, but also try to play that differences up in the exhibition space. Yeah. Maybe Shujuan would like to add more to that.
So just to add on to that, I think one interesting thing about Eng Tow in relation to Goh Beng Kwan is when she came back to Singapore in the 1980s, one of her first studios were actually in Sembawang. So she actually had a forest that she could kind of, go out and wander around, to observe the nature and rhythm. So I think that comes through very clearly in some of her works in the 80s as well, and also, continue to demonstrate her lifelong fascination with it. So some of the other connections that Goh Beng Kwan had with Eng Tow is they actually also went on workshops, like I believe a Filipino workshops. Yeah, to kind of I think it's also there how they are constantly investigating the materials and attending these workshops to kind of work on their art, I guess. Yeah. I think that's one. I think the key difference is, I guess, Joleen's exhibition is called Nervous City. Mine is Sixes. I think we tried to, in terms of rhythm, it's really, for her, more of the more dense, packed energy that, that you can see in the city. But Eng Tow is really like a step back from the city, to slow down and to observe and to look into it. Yeah. So I'll pass this on to Z and Adele.
Do you want to start first?
No, please do.
Oh, okay. Well, I think this is not just the sort of similarity between Hsin and Jaafar Latiff, but how dissimilar this last pair is compared to perhaps the four other artists in the show, which is, their art education or the lack thereof perhaps, and the kind of foundational formal training that both these artists undertook before they developed their artistic practice. So Jaafar Latiff was could not afford formal art education in Nanyang, and so he sort of signed up and enrolled in Teachers Training College, where he started learning pottery. And Hsin, of course, has her background in mathematics and later on computer science as well, but I'll leave it to Adele to elaborate further. And yet, I think through this kind of perhaps meandering manner of entering into their artistic practice, you could really see how they develop a sort of keenness and maybe an even a more unfettered embrace towards the new. They're not almost restrained by the kind of training that they perhaps might have received in art school. So I think that's one. But the other aspect, I suppose, which was already prefaced by Eugene earlier in his introduction, was the fact that, in the sort of mid-early 90s, at a point when, the world is sort of hurling towards new technologies in computer art and design, Jaafar sort of was launched into this whole new world because of his posting at the NIE as the instructional technical media specialist. And he was sort of tasked to teach computer graphics and computer animation. And there was his introduction to not just the hardware, which is, very rare at that point, which was a Commodore Amiga, but also the kind of newness of new graphics editing suites, which, predates what we see today of like the Photoshops and the likes of that. And so I think that newness did not faze him. In fact, he undertook that and sort of created quite a large body of works, of which 4 of that are on display in this exhibition in the time of textile, to sort of look at what it means to be constantly interested in the new. And I guess in relation to Lin Sin, spatially, we thought about how that could be that liminal space before you enter, as you exit from Jaafar and as you enter into Lin Sin, a kind of moment to introduce that. But of course, that's where the similarity ends, because Sin's approach to computer art is vastly different from Jaafar. Wouldn't you think so, Adele?
Well, I think our gallery is the real study of contrast.
That's
right?
true.
So,
that's true. Day
and
and
I think
night.
it is day and night, and I think it is really. I felt it was deliberate. Well, at least for me. Yeah, I consciously went into this, knowing that not only for the aspects that you've actually raised, but the fact that she is at the end. So she bookends that series of exhibitions. But as you can see from our logo, it's a kind of a semicircular. So I also see her exhibition as also circling back to the other artists in the series, but also as a way of opening up other sorts of questions, other provocations. I think one thing that we wanted to talk about but didn't manage to in the end is to actually raise also that aspect of gender, the place of women artists in this time. So we want to, I think, say more about this, but maybe akan datang somewhere later. We will raise this again. But the other thing I wanted to add is that this study of contrast is really important because I felt that Jaafar took quite a rational approach in terms of its layout. I really wanted a different affective approach to Lin Sin's exhibition. So it is the experiential really kind of took over, and I really wanted people to cast aside, preconceptions of whatever artistic milieu, training, baggage one might have, and just enter that space and be with the work and look at it for themselves.
I always thought that was just your contrarian attitude towards everything. I'm kidding. But yes,
that's to say that sometimes we neglect to actually talk about the individual dispositions of the curators and where they are in the shows. Most of the time, we tend to explain away why we do certain things purely from a kind of more strategic ways, but we haven't actually encountered ourselves in terms of our own emotional investments in the artists that we choose to work with. Yeah. And some of our artists are still with us, some not. So yeah, maybe the question should boomerang back to whoever wants to take this up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Adele. I think that's really interesting because for Mustafa and myself, it was something that we really had to grapple with. And I think we were very fortunate in that we didn't have to grapple with it alone. So I think I really want to mention here the family of Mohammad Din Mohammad, his widow, Hamida Jalil, and his amazing children. They were really on this journey with us, kind of working through not just the artwork selection, but I think trying to understand the deep layers of meaning in his work, which is something that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to access. I think given the vast kind of knowledge that Mohammad Din Mohammad had acquired, and it was something that he lived as well, we really needed the help of the family to make that apparent. And I think another point about kind of the curatorial kind kind of intervention or kind of, the way that we intervene with an artist's practice in the way that we choose to translate it in a particular way. For Mohammad bin Mohammad, it was the objects that really posed us a big challenge because the objects that Mohammad collected, they really range from the early 19th century to kind of the mid 20th century. And these objects, I think within a museum context, we were very, very aware that once we move these objects, wayang kulit, keris, old kind of serving plates, dishes, once they enter the museological context, the status changes, and there is a kind of point in which it can become ethnographic. But these objects, definitely for Mohammad bin Mohammad and his family, are not kind of dead objects. They're alive. They live with them in their home. He constantly reconstituted them in their artworks. So it was kind of a risk that Mustafa and I were playing with, by introducing these objects, very aware that they could change the nature of them. But, hopefully there was kind of a measure of success in that by kind of embracing that slippage between the objects, the assemblages, the paintings, the installations, the archives. Hopefully we were intending to present kind of the overall worldview of Mohammad bin Mohammad. So I guess that's one kind of point about curatorial kind of autonomy in the spaces.
Yeah, and I also realized in terms of the curatorial approaches taken by each of the curators, it's also very different. So some curators took on a more kind of approach that was maybe more chronological in their approach. Some deliberately chose not to be chronological, right? As Adele said, kind of adopting a more effective kind of experience of Lin Sin's works, and perhaps even in the case of, for example, Jaafar Latiff, he was kind of looking in terms of examining his practice by looking at how he was working in series and how the series was a way in which he rationalized a certain way of thinking and pushed it to its limits before moving on to the next series. Right? So I think that adds a certain rhythm that it's not kind of monotonous by an entire exhibition. And we hope that certainly visitors, when they come to something new must turn up, this is something that they will appreciate as well. And I'd like to pick up on Adele's point about book ending, right? The exhibition, we have two women artists who kind of book ended it. I think that's something that we should definitely come back to. But before we come back to that, Adele also brought up an important point about the circular and how these 6 artists are also connected. So earlier we talked about how they were paired, but here I also like to maybe discuss about how they are connected across as well. I'd like to start with Seok Tin, the exhibition of Seok Tin and Lin Sin actually, because we know that Seok Tin was also an important kind of writer. How writing was an important part of her practice that intersected with her art making as well, and the same can be said of Lin Sin, through her poetry. So perhaps Jia Yun can start us off by talking about the importance of writing in Seok Tin's practice.
So Seok Tin actually became a published writer, I think, almost slightly before she began her formal full-time art education in the UK at the Central St. Martin's with her foundation year in 1975. So her first piece of writing was titled 初知教编, or First Time Teaching. And in it, she really discusses just like the thrills and spills of someone who's entering, the education system from the teaching end for the first time. And I think this great kind of generosity of character that she has, her interest in young minds, is something that really spills over into her writing, but also into her unforgettable status as a printmaking lecturer, upon her return to Singapore from 1986 onwards. So as for writing, it can't be overstated. I think this was one big discovery, I think, for me personally, speaking of curatorial approaches, when it came to examining Seok Tin, not only as an artist, but a writer. And what's very striking about her is that I think she's incredibly versatile with the range of her registers. So as an artist, she can be incredibly academically rigorous, but also quite cryptic and conceptual in her late 1970s works. But in her writing, which is concurrent to these prints, that were made in the late 70s, you find that she's talking in a very kind of self-deprecating vernacular language, and she's engaging with a public that may or may not be entirely concerned with what she's making as an artist. So she was performing, these dual roles as an artist and writer extremely effortlessly. And I think that is really what also then makes and shapes her practice, even after almost a decade of fine art training. I think it's her ability to reach, into the kind of zeitgeist, actually, as a writer, that begins to then really take shape and crystallize in the works that she makes after her return to Singapore in 1986. So yeah, I would say that writing it has been a really rich resource for the exhibition, and I also took the opportunity to title each of the sections after texts that were synchronous with the set of works that was being presented, because I feel as if it's another dimension to Seok Tin as an artist that I felt could really be made visible and rendered to the visitor, and not only to those who are familiar with her written work, which I believe is actually quite a wide kind of reading base.
Yeah, indeed, because Seok Tin has published more than 13 volumes of her writings on a broad, kind of very broad aspects, but of course on culture and art as well. So I think, yes, but also in terms of other writers, right? So we talk about Lu Xun,
yes,
and somehow, and how that has also perhaps an influence on her interest in the human condition, right, which we also see in her works.
Absolutely.
So here maybe we can kind of connect to Adele and Lin Hsin being, such a prolific, writer as well.
So I like contrast, yeah. It's going to be quite different. She is primarily a poet. The vast amount of creative production is poetry. Although I have to say that she did quite a number of review articles for the Straits Times, because you were talking about zeitgeist, right? So she was plugging the zeitgeist or the tech zeitgeist of the day. So she was doing a lot of technology review articles, telling people what to buy, what to look out for. Yeah, but the poetry, was something that I was keen to kind of look at as something, not as a research resource, but something to play with, something that I could use as a key to try to understand some of the work that I'm looking at. Because you have to understand that we are primarily looking at an abstract art exhibition. A lot of things on the surface of the artworks are going to be quite opaque. So unless you're privy to certain information that you've read up or what the artist has told you, all the subjective bits that go on to that process of making, we have to go and find some other ways of getting into the work itself. So one of the ways which is, quite easy is to also pair up the poem and the artwork, which the artist has also done herself in her previous exhibitions. But then to use those moments, where she's either writing about, quite fleeting thoughts, or she's usually using the pieces of writing quite diaristically. So you can kind of piece together the moments as a kind of a, I won't say explanatory tool, but, there's a way in for you to get a sense of that emotional core of the work itself. So some of the works in the exhibition are paired with, a specific poem, so that you have some way of, beginning. But you can also cast it aside. That's not to say that, you need to have that. She's also published these poems in volumes, so you can actually go borrow the books and read them as they are. And she's put a number of them on her website as well. Yeah. So the funny thing about her writing process is also, well, she says that she doesn't really have evolved editing process when she writes. So it's really first blood, right? And she gets that moment, she jots it down, and then she closes her laptop and computer, and that's it. And she doesn't really need to go and revisit that. So in some ways, it's the kind of purest kernel of what that moment is. So she sees that, yeah, which is also why the exhibition is titled At the Speed of Thought, or At Speed of Thought, sorry. So there is that moment and that instantaneous quality that is being captured there, right? And some of the poems are also criticisms, grouses of the milieu that she was in. I think Seok Tin also will have some of that, where she is quite adamant about, you know, herself being an artist, being taken seriously, because there was that sense that they were not being taken seriously enough by their peers and by the public. I think this is a, you know, stream that undercuts quite a lot of, you know, what they say. And in fact, when I was preparing the show, many people didn't know who Lim Shujuan Tin is, despite the prolific production that she had from the 70s right up to the 90s. Yeah, that was actually quite, you know, surprising to me. So this was also the value of doing the exhibition itself. Yeah. Not to say that, you know, the exhibition is to kind of anoint her as, you know, kind of a celebrated artist. That's not the purpose of the exhibition. But I think we do want to use the opportunities that we have and the resources to bring to critical attention and start really looking at the works that these artists have made. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks, Adele. and I think it's really important, and really the aim of this exhibition, right? It's really to feature these 6 Singaporean artists, and you know their practices have been so multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, kind of playing with different materials, and some of them, you know, I think, you know, may not have been in the public attention, right, recently, and it's really an opportunity for us to relook at this group of artists whose practices were, you know, so important and active, especially post-independence Singapore, but also in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as well, to bring them back into the limelight, you know, if you want. So thinking about materials, right, and the diversity of materials used. So Ho Ho Ying talked about all these different objects, you know, that Mohammad you know, was collecting together with Hamidah Jalil. I'm interested to have a discussion about, you know, how critical was, you know, materiality, or the kind of diverse or experimentations in the use of materials. We could also expand it to perhaps to think about technology as well. And I think I'd like to start with Joleen, and perhaps you could talk about Goh Beng Kwan.
Okay. Yeah, I think materiality is so critical to an artist like Goh Beng Kwan, because it really kind of defined the way he innovated on collage. And this is also one reason why his time in Provincetown Workshop from 1964 to 65 was so critical to the artist, because that was really when he started for the first time working on collage under the teacher Leo Manso. And that really got him to start incorporating found objects and materials like rugs or discarded newspapers into his artworks. And later on, and when he then returned to Singapore, started looking out for culturally significant materials. And these were important not only as a symbolic device, but for the artist it was also interesting as to create this sort of optically rich and chromatically rich paintings. Often people think that Goh Beng Kwan is only just using these for its symbolic meanings, but also it was important for him as compositional devices. He was really thinking through collage via the idiom of painting. So it's not just important for him to make works that were responsive to certain cultural traditions that he was interested in, but also really thinking about them in a painterly way. So this being able to wield and employ all sorts of different materials were really critical to an artist like Goh Beng Kwan.
Yeah. And Joleen, would you like to tell us more about some of his metal works, which are actually shown for the first time, right, in terms of how he was using material in relation to, Singapore's industrialization and also independence, and his concern about our national defense.
Yeah. So working on this exhibition, we both Eugene and I realized that Goh Beng Kwan did produce steel assemblages, which he had never really shown before. And also, I guess, was not something he showed to Eugene, who has also worked with Goh Beng Kwan for quite some time. And so we really started to talk to him further and explore how these two metal assemblages came about. And he began to share more about how he was interested in not just paper and two-dimensional materials, but also interested in looking at techniques of welding. He was very interested at the time in architectonic shapes and geometric shapes. So if you can think about his other series that references doors and windows, you can see this continuation also in the steel assemblages that are on display in the exhibition. So actually those works came about in response to the withdrawal of British troops in Singapore around 1971, and the sort of growing rhetoric in public rhetoric around the need for national defense. So we started creating this sort of steel structures that references doors, gates, blockades, as a way of thinking about a small island city-state like Singapore trying to defend itself. So yeah, it was interesting to see how these works show Goh Beng Kwan's willingness to explore other sort of materials that he may not necessarily be known for.
And of course, another artist who was really pushing the boundaries of the medium itself, the material, would be Jaafar Latiff. So I'd now like to ask Z if we'd like to talk about Jaafar Latiff and his experimentations with batik painting.
Yeah, sure. I think before sort of like going into the details of Jaafar's sort of experimentation or exploration with the medium of batik itself is to perhaps look at the connotations that surround batik as a painting, as a medium, as this kind of like elevated modern artistic expression, as Frank Sullivan called it in 1968 when Chua Tian Ting had his first batik exhibition in Singapore, is to sort of unpack the word innovation with that medium quite inextricably, in a sense, like embedded, because the first level of marvel perhaps this region or the Singapore and Malaya had with the medium of batik is the fact that there was this turn in which Chua Tian Ting and the early pioneer artists who experimented with batik was managed to elevate a traditional craft into a modern art form or modern art expression. And this was then heavily instrumentalized in the 50s and the 60s. So it kind of goes back to the discussion of this anxiety that you mentioned earlier and what preceded it, which is the Malayanization, the kind of fervor to locate the hegemonic vision of Malaya. And this medium seems to carry all the promise of that vision. And so I think that is the first level of marvel of that innovation already. Like, wow, look at this. Tradition can actually be very modern and in vogue. But what I wanted to do with the exhibition and looking at the body of work that was produced by Jaafar was also then to really look at what are his specific technical exploration. And this is perhaps why I took a more sort of rational approach to looking at and paying homage in some ways to Jaafar's own meticulous and, almost sort of way of exhausting his own experiment or his technique. So in each of his series, albeit the fact that he would title his works in a numerical progression, so it would be the number of the painting, completed in which year. He had these series that felt like they were, they contain within a duration of that exploration. So if you look at Wandering series, he was really testing and learning how batik was sort of, batik painting can really be executed. So there was a lot of exploration in colors, how he applied colors in Wandering series. But as you look at Batik 87, 88 series and self-portrait that was executed in the early 90s, you could see that Jaafar was taking an approach of now using wax in a more expressive manner that was not previously visible in his earlier series. And that was really him saying that I'm learning the entirety or the spectrum of how the repertoire of painting with this medium entailed, and then breaking the rules in order to express myself. And I think in the late 80s, this sort of like technical exploration was also acknowledged or recognized by T.K. Sabapati, who wrote a review of his Batik 87, 88 series, where Jaafar was lauded as an artist who was able to now use wax as a medium or a vehicle of his own expressionistic desires. So I think this is, in a sense, interesting because he wasn't so much then thinking of how he could be a great batik painter, but rather how he could be a great abstract artist using the medium of batik, and really taking and exhausting each kind of constituent that is involved: fabric dye, wax, the chanting as not just a drawing implement, but also a way in which it could express that material on the substrate. So I think that's really like what's interesting about Jaafar, and how he then took that first level of marvel earlier about batik being this modern artistic expression into a completely new realm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really amazing how Jaafar Latiff kind of reimagined, batik, and pushed it beyond just being a medium or a technique, right, into something that he wanted to pursue, which was really abstraction. I think that's really important, and something that distinguishes him perhaps from other batik painters who were his peers. Well, we have another artist, of course, who was very actively experimenting in different types of materials, from bronze to paper, to cloth works as well. So maybe I'll invite Shujuan to talk about Eng Tow.
Yeah, so for Eng Tow, I really feel that what's really interesting is the ability to work through and work with different materials. And although I know she's perhaps to many people, she's still primarily known as a cloth artist, but she herself actually, she constantly worked with and even make some of the materials for herself. But even in terms of cloth, it's not just cloth. I mean, she's very, she understands and she really investigates, like, the composition of cloth. She'll be able to, even in terms of the materials that she used, she'll be able to say, this is 30% cotton, so 30% cotton and maybe 70% some other kind of fabric or thread. And that's why it can result in this kind of property, for her to be able to kind of create a relief out of the fabric. So I think that's really one element. And the other thing is that some of her paper works, actually many of them, she actually made the paper herself. So actually in working on this show, I worked closely with Eng Tow, and I think I'm very privileged to have the access to her, because there's also really quite few written resources on her, and she's generously allowed us access to her archives, and also allowed us for conversations with her in this respect. So we did work through with her in terms of looking at the artwork labels, in terms of the mediums of the works. So I think that's really key. And I think really one thing that really manifested through her works is not just about medium. So it's really about, the feeling of lightness and fluidity that I think that is really expressed through all the works that was displayed, particularly in this exhibition. I think that's really the spirit of it. So I think one of the first work that we spoke about of putting in the show was really the sculpture, The Rim of Infinity. So I think that really worked quite well in terms of creating that fluid light space in the exhibition. And it really also kind of shows how she managed to, working with the foundry, how she managed to kind of, defy the material properties of bronze, which is like really very monumental. But in this one, you can really sense the lightness of the material, but also through the, intervention or the lighting, which we also work very closely with her on. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Shujuan. Since we're talking about Eng Tow, maybe it's nice to circle back to Adele's question earlier about gender. And maybe we should have a discussion about it before we kind of take some questions from everyone who's on YouTube and Facebook joining us today. So I think it's really open. Anyone who would like to kind of discuss about, the position and place of women artists, in Singapore, particularly, through your research and working with the artists. Anyone wants to start? Perhaps Adele, since you asked that question.
I don't want my voice in this yet.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But
So
I'm curious too, perhaps, and like, I suppose the public is also curious about the selection of the artists for the show. Before we kind of like discuss the composition of the discrete exhibitions. So perhaps you can point it back.
Well, actually, incidentally, it's one of the questions that has been asked.
Okay.
So, what's the criteria? Of course, of selecting the 6 artists, and well, it's actually a long kind of curatorial process over the years since the National Gallery Singapore opened in 2015 with our long-term exhibitions, particularly Siapa Nama Kamu, right, which is our long-term display of looking at art in Singapore from the 19th century to the present. And through that exhibition, I think the curators have been in discussions, about which are the important artists that we would like to feature. Should we have the opportunity to have an exhibition like Something New Must Turn Up, whereby we are able to comparatively present 6 solo exhibitions of artists, particularly from the post independence generation of artists. And as we discussed further, we of course then kind of shortlisted some of these 6 artists because we were planning for this exhibition, and we looked at artists whose practices were very multidisciplinary, at other instances interdisciplinary. They were really kind of pushing the boundaries of thinking about and making art differently, which related back to the exhibition concept about the new. Right? So what is the new, and why were they artists, particularly after 1965, trying to push, different ways of making art by using different materials, different technologies, different, epistemes, if you want, different, different paradigms of thought, right? And kind of incorporating that in their practice, that created a very kind of pluralistic, kind of art world back in Singapore in the 70s and 80s. And from that, that concept, or the curatorial concept, we then shortlisted these 6 artists. But we were also very mindful, and this has been something that the curators have been advancing, and you will see it in our long-term exhibitions if you probably can have been, through our various rotations that we do throughout the years. You will see our focus on women artists. So this was not something that just came out, because of this exhibition, but it's been a continuous kind of work put in by our curators to research, as well as to collect works by women artists. So we thought this was a great opportunity to feature 3 women artists out of 6 in this exhibition, and that allowed us to really to have a deeper understanding of their practices, as what Shujuan mentioned, right? To be able to speak to the artists. And to have access to the archival materials and have a better understanding of the artistic practices. So that's really how I think we selected of course these 6 artists, and of course their works. We have a very strong collection of their works as well already. But of course this exhibition has allowed us to kind of strengthen our collections even further. Yeah. So perhaps we can swing back to that question about gender. And sure, any of the curators, feel free to pick it up. Anyone wants to go ahead? If not, Jia Yun, perhaps we can lead the way.
Yes, I will. But I'll lead in from a little bit of a tangent, I think. For our research on an exhibition that we did last year, myself, Joleen, Seng and Mustafa, Suddenly Turning Visible, Art and Architecture in Southeast Asia. A few years ago, we actually interviewed an artist in Malaysia who showed in Alpha Gallery alongside Eng Tow and Goh Beng Kwan as well. And we were interviewing her, and she said something that always stays with me to this day, because we were like, oh, if you were a young woman artist at the time, what were the opportunities like? Were you perceived differently? Were you treated differently? And she told us, very confidently that back then in the 70s, I was an artist first and a woman second. And I feel as if that statement is very much an ethos that I see resonating across artists, especially I think who were around, say, the Alpha Gallery milieu, for instance, and to an extent actually Seok Tin as well. But I think it's also to say that these issues, I think, have become much more visible to us and to the kind of historiography of art in the region. And just because an artist, in the 70s felt that this was how she was being treated, I think it doesn't mean that the treatment has held constant throughout time. So, but going back to Sharifa Fatima's statement, I do feel as if because of perhaps the kind of burgeoning interest in modernism and these like new and rapidly expanding horizons, there was really this investment in that sense of modernism as a kind of a universalist and almost kind of utopic arena within which women and men alike could compete on an equal platform, and to an extent, I think these were the currents that buoyed them forward during this time, and also allowed them to, not allowed them, but kind of like propelled them to kind of like charge forward and own a lot of their own narratives. And in my reading of Seok Tin, I feel as if this idea of gender is kind of just is embedded in her practice, but it's also something that she doesn't necessarily explicitly encode within her work. So yeah, I feel as if there's an interesting, sometimes almost suspension, I feel. But maybe this is also characteristic of artists who were operating during a time when the fight was so intense that they had to kind of like go for the jugular and just go for it and eke out their practice during this moment. And yeah, that kind of strength and grit is something that I definitely see manifest in Seok Tin's practice and her life story and journey, with or without the disability.
So I just want to add on to this. So I actually did ask Eng Tow this question one day when we were in a taxi. So she, same as Sharifa, I believe, she also said that she was first and foremost an artist. So for her, that was, being a woman was kind of secondary to her as well. I think what's important to note, perhaps, for us as an institution and researchers, it's the amount and level of research that has happened throughout the years. As you know, I'm also in the Georgette Chen curatorial team together with Hui Min. I think that there has been, so many publications on, not just Georgette, but also on Chong Su Ping, Liu Kang, etc. I think it's really kind of timely that we really cast an eye on this. The artists in the post-1965 period, and I think that's really what this exhibition is hoping to do and looking to do, and I really hope that every one of you can kind of come and visit the show, because I think it's really rare, for an institution and even for the artists, and the artist family to be able to come together to put together, such an exhibition and to share their works and collections together with their collectors for us. So I think what's really required as well is really, the research that we have to continue to do while some of the artists are still around, while some of the artist family, who are directly in contact with the artists are able to, and that's from me, yeah.
I just want to put a disclaimer to clarify, what we've been discussing, which is important, that we are asking questions about gender, but we're not using their gender as the reason for inclusion. Okay, I think that is an important thing to bear in mind, because my immediate response to, wanting to take up Lim Shujuan as a curatorial project, but not because she's a female artist, right? But I wanted to ask questions about being a female artist in this milieu. And the interesting thing is that through going through the materials, I've also kind of, discovered patterns of selection of that time. Questions about why is she the only token female in these, numerous committees. So there are, these blind spots that we've never actually raised to our vision, I think suddenly come to the fore, because there was, I think at that time, no adequate explanatory framework as to why some things had to be the way they are. So they also come across as sometimes, a little bit facetious, or people didn't really think too much about it, that they just needed somebody there to kind of balance the equation a little bit, although it is immensely unbalanced anyway. So the thing is, the question still remains with us today, right? So we have to be more cognizant of why we are doing something. And what questions are we posing to these artists and their works every time we put them up? Yeah. More so than, say that, we have a slate of female artists and we want to put them on this pedestal. I don't think that's, what we are going to do and want to do. And I would also say that, some of the dismissive, remarks from, male colleagues or male peers may not necessarily have to do anything to do with them being a female artist per se. Yeah. So I think we need to be quite specific in terms of how we pitch, the quality of their criticism, and not to kind of lump them all into this barrage of, they're just prejudiced against women artists in that way. Yeah. So the question of gender, I think, is also open to the other male artists in this series as well. Yeah, whether or not the question of being a woman in this particular period had ever any appeal, to their practices and their depictions, yeah, and their own interactions with, their female peers. Yeah. The difficulty of this particular exhibition is that a lot of it is also abstract.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's not, too many examples of figurative works where you can actually have a direct correlation, as to say representation. Yeah. I just wondered if any of you thought about this.
Well, I mean, thanks for raising this, Adele. I agree with you. I think the thorny aspect of a topic like gender isn't so much as a kind of criterion of inclusion or appraisal, i.e., and this is where perhaps like Sharifa Fatima's to Eng Tow's kind of like own acknowledgement of how they identify themselves in relation to their artistic practice is not so much that I'm a woman and so I need to be included, but I think it goes back to a very simple question of, in spite of that, that subjective identification, how many artists today do we remember or do we think of? Does the public, recognize? And I think this is the task of history or research rather than the task of the artists to make themselves visible. And this is still the unfinished task that I think it's constantly in our mind. So so obviously, like in terms of curating Jaafar Latiff, then it has brought to fore other aspects that are also under research, perhaps within arts historical scholarship, which I thought were interesting. And I think gender, therefore, brings about, in this sense, in today's kind of contemporary research, what are the intersections that we have forgotten or that lack primary materials for us to dive into in order to write about these artists. So yeah, I guess these are my thoughts, that you're right, that the gender is not the criterion of selection, but it is a very important aspect through which we within institutions and researchers everywhere else have to sort of like think through. So it's a bit of that relationship between the present, what we're doing, versus the past, which is the objects and the works that we are looking at and appraising. Yeah.
Being male is also a gendered, gendered position.
Yeah.
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 So we haven't actually, we have unfinished business asking questions about male artists as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is definitely a big topic that deserves its own kind of conversation, right, about gender, which we should have at some point as well. We have another question, quite a specific one, but I think that's something that all the curators can discuss, which is really about challenges, right? And the question is really about challenges faced when incorporating lighting in Sin's exhibition. But of course, we like to broaden this question to challenges that
Please.
every curator faced when they have been when they're working on this exhibition. So maybe we'll leave the exciting one last for Adele, and we can start instead with Jia Yun.
Yes. So I think for Seok Tin, the challenge has been that I would say actually relative to many of the artists in the exhibition, Seok Tin has had actually quite a few exhibitions over the last 3 decades. So I think the challenge that was the most pressing I felt was how to perhaps reframe, I think, the story around Seok Tin, and to look also beyond her disability as well as a defining attribute of how her practice has been presented in the last 3 decades. And I say this in order to then better actually understand the amount of obstacles that she had to overcome at that point where she lost her sight in August 1988. So I think the challenge was very much the fact that Seok Tin is an extremely prolific artist, and to really also then single out certain moments, I think, where she's actually also being challenged as an artist, and her status as kind of this senior figure of printmaking in Singapore was not yet so kind of enshrined and stable. And this, I think, was very much something that occurred in the late 1970s at her first monographic exhibition in Singapore. So I feel as if the challenges were really about surfacing, I think, some of these earlier moments of tension, and the fact that the reception of her work at that point, as a young artist, wasn't necessarily uniform with praise, but was in fact quite mixed. So, yeah, I would say that was the challenge that I saw and located in the particular context of organizing this exhibition. But yeah, everyone.
Well, before we
else.
move to Hui Min,
Yeah.
really like to invite everyone to kind of key in your questions, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. Please keep those questions coming in. All right, over to you, Hui Min.
Thanks. I guess for Mohammad, the challenge, I wouldn't say so much a challenge, but a real question that Mustafa and I were really engaging with concurrently as we were working through the exhibition has a lot of the same kind of complexities and baggage as with the question on gender, and that's really the question of how do we locate Malay artists within our historical discourse, and perhaps this is something that Z can speak to as well, because we did have quite a few conversations about it. And Mohammad in particular, he was an artist that was really looking for how he could bring in his traditional healing into his art and his art into his traditional healing. So there's this whole other aspect of a different type of cultural references that he was drawing from. But at the same time, as he was collecting all these materials and assembling them, like what Joleen mentioned about Goh Beng Kwan collages, Mohammad Din's work also had a very formal aspect to it. So how do we locate an artist who was so diverse and so all-encompassing in the way that he approached his life and art, and see him beyond, certain cultural confines? Because I felt like Mohammad Din Mohammad was really such an exciting example through which we could broaden this understanding. Because his idea of Malayness or Malay world was one that was linked to a much broader international and deep philosophical questioning about how we should be in the world. He traveled to Paris to meet with Sufis there. He held exhibitions in Turkey as well as in China. He was very close with the Modern Art Society in Singapore as well. So I think those are some of the questions and challenges that the exhibition posed to us. Yeah. So, Joe?
Okay.
Joleen?
I'll be quick since we are running out of time. But similar to Jia Yun, Goh Beng Kwan also had several exhibitions and solo exhibitions prior, and recently while we were planning the exhibition, also recently produced a monographic catalogue of his work. So a lot of my thinking was, how do we rethink or relook at Goh Beng Kwan's artistic practice? And so for me, focusing on the city and the urban context for Goh Beng Kwan was a very useful way of thinking through his abstract language. Adele mentioned earlier on that I guess unless audiences have a kind of lead into understanding the works or have some sort of information about them, abstraction can be quite intimidating for audiences. So with Goh Beng Kwan, I found that looking at this sort of urban context was one way of not only responding to the concept of something new must turn up, but also a way of rereading his practice. And I did find that thinking through the urban context was very productive in asking more questions, especially around ideas of progress, right? Of this idea of Singapore's endless progress and its impact that it might have on, say, its urban fabric. So you see in his works this certain zeal for modernization at the time, but also a sense of ambivalence that came through in these works. So thinking through Goh Beng Kwan's works, and also so especially encountering them in a time of a pandemic and a climate crisis, it posed for me more questions about whether this sort of rhetorical promises of progress are still viable.
Yeah, so for me, contrary to Goh Beng Kwan and Chng Seok Tin, so Eng Tow did not have a kind of a big solo exhibition. So I think in this exhibition, really what was really important to me was to show some of her early works in the 1970s, works that she made when she was in the Royal College of Arts. So if you take a look at her CV online, you can see that, she received like the New Craftsman Award, issued by the Telegraph UK in the 1970s. But I think that aspect is really very rarely explored. So that was really one thing that I really set out to do. And also in working with her, with our colleagues at our exhibition management to kind of figure out ways to display her works, because I think that is really one key important aspect that we have to work with the artists, and that it's really important to present it to the audience. So I think that's really kind of one challenge, like in the absence of materials, but thankfully with her help, we are able to kind of gain access and more information. And I think another challenge is really in terms of displaying, the different kind of materials, really just present her to be really, as an artist who's interested in, aspects of nature and how that's kind of expressed through her different works. I think that's also kind of one challenge in terms of working with the space too and the circulation. So one suggestion that I would give, if you've been here and you kind of went through the exhibition a different route, go through Eng Tow's space from the other side, which is from the historical lobby side, and walk through there, because from there you'll be able to kind of see perhaps the transition of her kind of early works perhaps more clearly in that sense. Yeah. So why we started the early works on that side, it's because really of the space is more intimate, it's smaller, and that's more suitable for her more minimalist work in the early days as well. Yeah, so that's it from me.
I guess there are two key challenges for me in terms of approaching Jaafar Latiff in terms of research and the exhibition making. in terms of the research, I think compared to, again, the other artists in something new must turn up, I did not have the opportunity to, work with the artists. Jaafar passed on in 2007. But at the same time, Jaafar was not an artist who wrote a lot. And so there was not a lot of sort of perhaps primary materials for me to dive in and look at, the artistic sort of practice through his own lens or own words. So unlike, say, Chng Seok Tin or Mohammad Din Mohammad, where the ability to access that extensive archive was able to kind of help to piece particular narrative or biography of the artist. With Jaafar, I had to rely on the things around the artist. So old photographs, his writings of the modules of batik workshops that he conducted in the various institutes that he was teaching in, and actually extensive discussions. And to this, I owe my debt to, previous curators or researchers such as Constance Shears, who was a kind of like a close companion, but also collaborator who curated some of Jaafar's early solo exhibitions at NMAG, TK Sabapati, but also Syed Muhammad Hafiz, and various other batik artists to kind of understand that world around Jaafar Latiff's practice. And the second aspect or challenge, I suppose, is, and I have to take a step back to look at, the context of making this exhibition within this current times, which is the fact that when we started, doing research, it was at a point that COVID has just begun, and that was very, very difficult for us to be able to access also sources and collectors and other types of organizations to access and look at the kind of broad spectrum of where these artists' works are also sort of like collected and where are they deposited. So thankfully, whilst the exhibition begin from the fact of looking at the wealth of our own national collection, that particular aspect of organizing an exhibition in a time of pandemic really reveal some of the limitations of access as well. Yeah.
Maybe I should end on the happy note. So I want to rephrase the question. So it's not so much challenges, but opportunities that I've had with the exhibition. And I want to say that, I also am grateful for the artists letting me have almost like a free hand in terms of doing the exhibition design and taking it to the extent that I could take it. But also it was an immensely rewarding experience in terms of being able to experiment with the space. And then we did stuff, or I managed to do stuff that was not tried before. Of course, my colleagues may have some raised eyebrows and some moments of like, is this really going to happen? And how well is it going to be done? But a word of thanks to the lighting team, because I think that is the, some people have said the MVP of the exhibition, the lighting schema. But before we get to lighting, I want to first talk about the walls, because we did, a particular treatment where the paint faded down as you get down towards the floor. But that was, in my mind, something I wanted to do because I wanted to have a situation where I wanted to see if I could make the walls, the background that was originally usually the support of the paintings, be on the same plane with the artworks themselves. So there was a kind of a bleed between the two surfaces. And I took that, that fading effect as an echo of also the artwork's own effects on the canvas, right? So I just wanted to use that echo and use that as a kind of motif that ran across the room. So there was this low horizon line, but as you go inside, it also destabilizes you. You don't know exactly if you're on terra firma. So it also adds to, that whole aspect of, where am I, right?
Effective curating.
Yes. Affective curating, as Z says. And then coming to the lighting itself. Okay, this is a specific point because artists of this period have tended to have their works collected by corporates. Many artworks have been sequestered away in, various warehouses and then now dispersed. Most of the times hanging in offices, right? Where you just have this kind of harsh fluorescent lighting. No one really cared about how to light the work, So this was that moment of redress. And what kind of treatment would I be able to give it such that it will really dramatically transform that viewing experience? And then subsequently, as a kind of more practical gesture, because these works were all framed in a disparate manner. So in order to train your attention onto the painting surfaces themselves and be able to draw out, subtleties that you wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. So the use of the beam shapers was stroke of genius, not just my genius, but the lighting team's genius as well. So it really took away all the extraneous things from your line of sight. And you could really just focus on the works themselves. And so they glowed in the space. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that's a happy note to end on.
Yeah, I think it's also, something that we like to encourage, visitors to come. We like to invite everyone to come to see the exhibition. And I'm sure you must be intrigued by what Adele has just verbally, communicated.
Also, you cannot photograph the exhibition, you
have
to experience it yourself.
Exactly. So really like to extend this invitation to everyone to come see the exhibition, which ends on the 22nd of August. Right. So please do come down. I'd also like to, thank all the curators, for sharing your thoughts and also your experiences curating this exhibition. The publications of this exhibition, they are on sale right now, so you can come to our museum shop as well as our online distributors to get access to these catalogs. So please grab your copy. But last but not least, please do scan the QR code coming up on the screen, which is the next slide, to leave us your feedback. And for those who have posted comments or questions, yes, so we will definitely take note of them. And if there's an opportunity, we'll certainly like to also respond because we didn't have sufficient time today to do so. So thank you, take care, keep safe, and see you all at the gallery. Right, bye-bye.